Hello friends, welcome back to my channel Mukesh English. Now let's have a discussion of important 2 marks questions from the poem My Grandmother's House by Kamala Das. This poem is in the syllabus of second semester BCom General English, Bangalore University. Very first question, who is the poet of the poem My Grandmother's House? Kamala Das. What does the poet long for in the poem? Desire. The poet desires for the love and the warmth she experienced at her grandmother's house during her childhood. Where was the poet's grandmother's house located? The poet's grandmother's house was located in Malabar, Kerala. Important question. Then, what does the poet describe about her grandmother's house? The poet describes her grandmother's house as a place of happiness, comfort, and love, which she misses deeply. How does the poet feel after her grandmother's death? After her grandmother's death, the poet feels a deep sense of loss and emptiness as the house is no longer the same without her grandmother. Then, what symbolizes the poet's lost happiness in the poem? The poet's lost happiness is symbolized by the darkness and silence that now pervade in the grandmother's house. What does the poet want to do if she could visit her grandmother's house again? The poet would like to look through the windows of her grandmother's house to recapture some of the love and happiness she experienced there in the past. What does the phrase blind eyes of windows suggest in the poem? The phrase blind eyes of windows suggests the lifeless and vacant appearance of the house, reflecting the poet's sense of loss and nostalgia. Why does the poet say she has begged at strangers' doors? The poet says she has begged at strangers' doors to express her desperate search for love and acceptance after losing the warmth of her grandmother's house. How does the poem reflect Kamala Das' typical style? The poem reflects Kamala Das' typical style through its confessional tone, emotional intensity, and the exploration of personal themes like loss, longing, and the search for identity and love. What does the poet mean by the phrase snakes moving among books? It means the neglect and the decay of the house after her grandmother's death, which indicates how the house has been abandoned and forgotten. Then, how does the poet describe her feelings towards her present life compared to the past? The poet feels a sense of emptiness and lack of love in her present life compared to the warmth and the affection she experienced at her grandmother's house in the past. What is the significance of the darkness mentioned in the poem? Very important question. The darkness signifies the poet's sorrow and the void left by her grandmother's absence, as well as the literal and metaphorical emptiness in the house and in her life. What role does nostalgia play in the poem? Nostalgia plays a central role in the poem as the poet reminisces about her childhood memories at her grandmother's house, highlighting her longing for the past and emotional refuge it provided. How does the poet use imagery to convey her emotions? The poet has used imagery like blind eyes of windows, darkness, to evoke a sense of loss and abandonment, effectively conveying her deep emotional pain and a desire for her mother's love. What does the poet imply by wanting to peer through blind eyes of windows? The poet implies her desire to reconnect with her past and relive the moments of love and joy she experienced at her grandmother's house despite knowing that it is no longer possible. How does Kamala Das portray the theme of love and loss in the poem? Kamala Das portrays the theme of love and loss in the poem through her recollection of the affectionate bond she shared with her grandmother and the profound sense of loss she feels after her grandmother's death, which leaves an irreplaceable void in her life. What is the tone of the poem? The tone of the poem is melancholic and nostalgic. Why does the poet refer to herself as begging for love? Because she emphasizes here her desperation after losing the unconditional love and comfort she once had at her grandmother's house. How does the poem reflect Kamala Das' personal experience? By delving into her childhood memories, the emotional impact of her grandmother's death, and her ongoing quest for love and belonging in her adult life. What does the poet remember about the atmosphere of her grandmother's house? The poet remembers the atmosphere of her grandmother's house as being filled with love, comfort, warmth, which she is now missing after her grandmother's death. How does the poet use contrast in the poem? The poet uses contrast by comparing the warmth and the love she felt at her grandmother's house with the coldness and the lack of love in her current life. What is the significance of the line, I, who have lost my way and beg now at strangers' doors? It signifies the poet's sense of disorientation and loneliness after losing the love and security of her grandmother's house, making her feel like a beggar who is in search of affection. What is the what does the poet imply by saying the house has become desolate? She would like to say that the house, once it was filled with life and love, now the house has become empty and abandoned, which mirrors her own feelings of loneliness and loss. How does the poem explore the concept of home? The poem explores the concept of home as a place of emotional refuge and unconditional love, which the poet finds in her grandmother's house, contrasting with her current sense of alienation, loneliness, and longing. What does the phrase, the house withdrew into silence, signifies? It signifies the lifelessness and emptiness that took over the house after the death of the poet's grandmother, which indicates a sense of abandonment and loss. What is the significance of the books mentioned in the poem? The books in this poem signify the knowledge and memories which are now neglected and gathering the dust, which also shows the decay and abandonment of the once lively and lovely household. What does the poet mean by the line, I listen for the laughter of years past? That means the poet is longing to hear the joyful sounds of her childhood, which are now has remained just memories, and these memories are haunting her in her present life. Why does the poet feel a sense of guilt or regret? The poet feels a sense of guilt or regret because she's unable to relive the past or bring back the love and warmth she experienced at her grandmother's house, leaving her feeling helpless, leaving her feeling helpless and sorrowful. The last question, how does the poet express the idea of unfulfilled desires in the poem? By longing to revisit her grandmother's house and recapture the past love and happiness, knowing that it's an impossible wish, which highlight her sense of yearning and sorrow. So, friends, this is how I have tried my best to bring out 30 questions from this poem. My Grandmother's House by Kamala Das. Hope you have liked these 2 marks questions. Thank you so much. Subscribe the channel if you have not yet done it.